invite you into a little bit of my worldview and some of what I'm thinking. And to start with, I want to tell you about stories. We all love a good story. Humans are really great with stories. We can remember lines of a movie we just saw or saw years ago. We can start singing a song to a tune that we last heard when we were children. We love telling juicy bits of gossip. And with that, we have this great, fantastic innate ability to tell stories, to listen to stories, and to remember them quite accurately for a long period of time. And that comes with a really profound responsibility that we have to hold on to and capture knowledge and convey it in a truthful way. Our ability to tell stories, from my perspective, comes from our sense of being able to manage tools. And we used to think that tool use was only in the purview of humans. Not so. We've got tools that are being used by monkeys. Here we've got a macaque who's taking a stone and cracking open some shellfish to eat. We've got this octopus who's carrying a coconut shell that he's going to hide in. Or the dolphin who has picked up a sponge so they can scooch around the ocean floor, scaring up some fish to eat. And the mother dolphin actually trains her young how to use that sponge properly. We have tool use in birds. Not just making nests. This crow is actually reshaping and fashioning this stick so they can pull out grubs and things to eat. And of course, our ancient ancestors, 3.3 million years ago, had access to tools, stone tools that you can see here. And if we look across the sweep of time, here's some of our ancestors that we can see going back 4 million years or so. And I think all of these ancestors were using tools. Now, tools of a sharpened stick or tools that are made of bone, they're going to be lost to time. We only see tools if they were actually made and refashioned out of stone. But across this whole sweep of time, we've got tool use. And I think it's good to think about time for a second. Imagine going back not just to your grandparents or great-grandparents, but going back 20 generations. That's about 500 years. 500 years ago, let's see, Henry VIII was still king and he was working on his first wife. The sailors that sailed with Magellan who survived the round-the-world trip were just getting back to Spain. Martin Luther just got excommunicated. And we have to wait 150 years for Descartes' Principia of Philosophy and 180 years for Newton's Principia of Mathematics. Now, if we take that 500 years, those 20 generations, and multiply it by 4,000, think of all the generations that are in between there. That 4,000 puts us smack into the middle of this chart, puts us out at 2 million years. And it's in that moment of time that some of our ancient ancestors invented a tool which completely shifted our whole evolutionary trajectory. And that tool was very simply this. And it's not fire for cooking. Think about what you do when you have a fire. If you have a fire pit or a campfire, you're going to sit around it, you're going to feel safe and warm. You're going to talk about the events of the day. You're going to tell stories. That's what happened to our ancient ancestors, I think. In that safe space, they started to talk about the events of the day, to share what was going on, talk about how Steve made that stick so sharp that caught the animal that we're eating now, or how Sally found these berries in some part of the woods for us to eat. Now, clearly, our ancient ancestors did not have the vocal structures to talk like you and I. But that's the point. Having this safe space to do that is what I call a genetic selective pressure. It's something that's going to push us towards being able to communicate more effectively, to turn those vocalizations into something that is more like language. We all talk with our hands. Well, that's left over from when we were talking with our hands because we didn't have language. This is going to be changing over the many, many generations that fill in that 2 million years. Now, from here, we start facing lots of other challenges. And one of the big challenges is climate. And I want to look here at just the last 120,000 years. And we know that concentration of CO2 in the air is in lockstep with temperature. That's what that plot is showing. And 120,000 years ago, we started this era not alone as Homo sapiens, but probably with as many as 8 cousins living with us on the planet. And by that I mean the Neanderthals and the Denisovians and perhaps even Homo erectus and a bunch of other species. But times was really hard, it was really challenging. And here we can see there's a dramatic drop in temperature that happened about 74,000 years ago. And that coincides with Mount Toba, a gigantic volcano blowing up in Sumatra. And here's a picture of Mount St. Helens blowing up. Mount St. Helens blew up in 1980. It made a mushroom cloud that was 40 miles wide. It made a cloud that reached 15 miles into the air. It dumped a cubic kilometer of ash over 10 states. When Mount Toba blew up, it was 10,000 times the size. It dumped out so much ash that some scientists think that it changed the global temperature within a year by dropping it by 30 degrees. Plants and animals are going to have a really hard time surviving. Within that, Toba caused a severe ozone depletion, and that was because it spewed out so much sulfur dioxide that it changed the atmosphere. With the change in atmosphere, is going to create a lot more UV radiation. Cancer increases. People start getting cataracts. Survival is going to be really hard. And some scientists have calculated that the human population was an endangered species. Our numbers worldwide were 10,000 or less. Now, clearly, some of us adapted well. I mean, we're here, so some of us adapted well. And there's a great study that just came out a few months ago that identified a group of people living in Eastern Africa who used to be hunters on the savannah. And when this event happened, they changed. They changed their lifestyle and changed to fishing, and they survived and did well. Now, time marches on, and there are more challenges that we face. I think one of the other big challenges that I like to think about is here, 42,000 years ago. The magnetic field of the Earth flipped. So if you took out your old Boy Scout compass and it was pointing north, what would happen is it would start pointing south. And clearly, our ancestors back then weren't using a compass. But the value of that magnetic field is it is our protective shield that protects us from the cosmic radiation, it protects us from the solar wind and coronal mass ejections, the big solar flares. Now sometimes we get to see the effect of those things because the charged particles spiral down the magnetic field lines near the North Pole or South Pole, and we see it as the northern lights, the aurora borealis. But when this field inversion happens, that magnetosphere shrinks down. It gets a lot smaller. And actually it goes all the way to zero for a time. And as a consequence of that, we're going to have a time where the ozone, again, has thinned. Cosmic rays are coming down on us, and UV radiation is very high. We're going to have a lot higher incidence of cancer and cataracts. It's going to change the weather. And it's going to change the aurora borealis. Visualize this with me. You can see the northern lights shimmering in the sky. And you might not know this, but even now, if you are far north and have a high-intensity northern light experience, the northern lights actually come lower in the atmosphere. And you can hear them. They crackle and they pop and they sing. Now, when this big event happened, the northern lights wouldn't have been northern. They would have been all the way down to the tropics. They would have been so intense that they're low in the atmosphere. They might have been so bright you could see them in the daytime. You would hear that sound crackling and singing in the air. You'd see these shimmering lights at night, and there would be bolts of lightning ripping out of those clouds. How apocalyptic is that? No wonder we invented Zeus, or Indra, or Thor. And that's not just normal lightning and thunder. This is like a light show. So that's how I think some of these stories get started. During this event, you really want to stay out of the sun. If you would feel it hot on your skin, you would be burning right away. So with that, I think it's obvious that people started, high real estate of getting into rock shelters. And even at this time, we've got this beautiful pig that's on a cave wall in Indonesia that was put up 42,000 years ago, right in this era. And we have all this other great art in France, and beautiful horses. And this horse I love because it looks exactly like we see them today. How accurate is that? And we know that the symbols above that horse are actually been interpreted to help keep track of the calendar and when this hunting probably happened. And you can see arrows diving into this horse, shooting into this horse. There's a sense of animation here. In fact, some of the cave paintings are animated like a rotoscope. If you move a torch in front of them, they will look like the animal was galloping. Now, high art is evident here, but this is not the birth of art. Our ancient ancestors were making art long before this. We see it here because it's safe, it's in a cave. It's not on the skin, the animal skin, it's not on your partner's back. Those things get lost to time. We know evidence of people using paints and beading from 110, 150,000 years ago. People who would be Homo sapiens like you and I, people who would have been Neanderthals, who are now long extinct and only has vestiges in our genome. And in fact, there were people 540,000 years ago, 500,000 years ago, that were making creative art. And they would have been Homo erectus, not even Homo sapiens. So I want to tell some stories that are familiar. I think Zeus is relatively familiar, but the next story comes into the frame of oh yeah, over this 120,000 years, it got cold. And we call it the Ice Age because there's a lot of ice. And if there's a lot of ice, that means there's less water in the ocean, so that the sea level is much lower. Sea level would have been about 120 meters lower than what it is. That's about 400 feet. So the continental shelves would have been exposed. America, the United States, would have been about 30% larger than what it is today. But I want to look at Australia. And here's the continent of Australia, and you can see the continental shelf exposed. The people came to Australia by walking in from Papua New Guinea. And these First Nations people moved across Australia starting around 60,000 years ago, ending up all the way down here in Tasmania about 40,000 years ago. And then after that, the sea levels began to rise, the flooding took over, and for example, Tasmania got cut off from the rest of Australia and just a few islands in between. Now, I have to interject sort of a weird little story here. During the American Revolution, you've all heard of that, the colonies beat Great Britain. Great Britain didn't like that. They felt they really needed the colonies. So in 1788, like right after the US colonies won the war, Great Britain sends their ships to Australia to start a colony there. And imperial colonies here in America and Australia and all over the world were pretty brutal to the First Nations people. I mean, if they didn't die of disease, they were sequestered in what we would call reservations. Here, the First Nation peoples in Tasmania were sequestered on Fiddler's Island. And the governing British had a government employee, George Robinson, who was hired to help facilitate this process in a friendly way. He's actually exiling everybody to Fiddler's Island. But one good thing that Robinson did is he took great notes about the oral traditions and the oral histories of the people that he was sequestering on this island. And one of the stories that was told to him was by a fellow named Timler. And Timler told him about the flooding, seas filling in, that blocked Tasmania off from Australia. And you see, Robinson thought, okay, this is a quaint story, you know, oceans don't do this, but it's like a myth that adjusts for how people got here. But Timler had more to the story than just the story. He had his receipts. He had a drawing of a star chart of what the sky looked like at the time of the flooding. And the way he depicted this was to lay two spears on the ground and then draw in the sand where the stars were, where the spears were giving you these axes for alignment of the stars. And to our benefit, Robinson actually put this in his notebook, faithfully drew it. But when he drew those stars, he looked at it and recognized some of the stars in the sky, but not all of them. A bunch of them in this drawing were in the wrong place. And he didn't really think much of it after that. Recently, though, some scientists have looked at that star chart and recognized that, oh yeah, the Earth has this precessional axis. The stars in the sky are not fixed. They move around. There's all this celestial mechanics going on. And you take that into account and go back into time when the stars are in that position. It's 11,800 years ago. It's the time when the flooding happened. And here's a story that telling of the flood and giving you this detailed star map that's been passed down from generation to generation to generation for thousands of years. How cool is that? Now, one of the researchers who did this also went on to find more stories around the world. We're going to pop into Scotland, where the people of Scotland used to be able to walk out to the Outer Hebrides, the islands just off the North Shore. And he collected all these stories of different islands that, different land masses that became islands because the flooding happened over slightly different times. And when you correlate, when you go look at the rate of sea level rise from 20,000 years to 10,000 years, that's remarkably linear. And within that plot, we're looking at the sea level rising about 10 meters every 1,000 years. Well, that sounds like a long time and maybe not a lot of water. It's 30 feet of water. But you do the math, and it's actually quite simple. It's 1 centimeter a year. Well, a centimeter doesn't sound like too much either. But a centimeter a year ends up being about a foot of sea level rise over a 30-year lifespan. Well, that means because people like to live near water, they're going to have to keep moving. They're going to have to keep moving back. And we know from the TV news of the storm surge that a big storm is going to move a lot of water in a big way. So people who live near the coast are constantly needing to move. People who live near rivers that are near the coast are going to constantly see their water become brackish. And it doesn't stop. I mean, over these 10,000 years, the sea level just keeps rising and keeps rising and keeps rising. And then finally it stops. It levels off. We see stories of flooding, of sea level rise, all around the world. And we know some of those stories by heart, because we know the stories of Gilgamesh or Noah, that these flood stories have this basis. So let's hop from Scotland back into France. I want to look into the caves one more time. So we are back in Lascaux, and in here there's this beautiful bull painted on the wall. And a researcher in Spain, Congregadoro, he was looking at this bull and recognized, well, it's a beautiful bull, but there's all these spots on its face that probably shouldn't really be there. It's just a bull. And there's spots around. And then it hit him. These are not just spots. These are stars. These are the constellations of Orion, Taurus the Bull, and the Pleiades. Now, when I was a child in Scouts, I learned about the Pleiades, and it's also known as the Seven Sisters. And I remember on our scouting trip looking up and seeing the Pleiades, and when counting them, I said, there's 6 stars. Why are we calling it the Seven Sisters? Well, this is what our star map would look like today. There's Orion. Most people can pick that out. The Pleiades are this little spot over here in that circle. And when we look at them, we see the 6 stars, just like Subaru's logo. Subaru is Japanese for the Pleiades. It's all the same. And the big star is actually those 2 stars on the side over there. And for you and I, looking with the naked eye, those 2 stars are too close together to be resolved. So they look like a big bright star. So here we are with a story about Orion and the 7 sisters, and it's a story in Greek mythology, it's a story in Chinese mythology, it's a story in Australian First Nations people about the hunter chasing the 7 sisters. Well, again, if you go back in time, about 100,000 years ago, those 2 stars are far enough apart that you can resolve them. So the inference from this is that here's a story about the 7 sisters and Orion chasing them that's in cultures all around the world, and the last time that you could see the 7 stars was 60 or 100,000 years ago. That this is a story that's that old, that has been passed down in all these different cultures around the world. Now, shortly after this, in my sensibility, storytelling goes to print. And I put this up just as a shout out. The woman in the middle there is Echuena. She is the first known author of literature in the world, so shout out to Wendy. Thank you very much. She wrote great poetry and songs that have been handed down over the generations. You can read them today if you want. And we know that writing started off with these symbols of like a picture of an ox head or a hand. Ox would be the word alf, and hand would be kaf. And those symbols sort of started getting morphed around, and the sounds of them hung on. And we Phoenicians had the good idea of turning this into phonetic sounds, and we have our Amplify today. So what do I think? Come on. There we go. You evolved from creating and manipulating tools. Without a doubt, that's something that we've been doing for a long time. We've evolved for storytelling, music, and language. We've evolved for artistry as well. We are not evolved for reading and writing. Those things are brand new. They're only a few thousand years old, and in fact, it's only in the last 100 years or so that people have been learning how to do it. So we even see that today because about 130 million adults in the U.S. can't effectively read like you see in college. So we have this challenge. We have this profound ability to tell and listen to stories and remember them across generations. We're not very good at discriminating truth from alternative facts or myth. We really generally believe what we're told. So for me, understanding the dichotomy of believing what we're told in relationship to what is factually true is at the heart of advancing society. Truth matters. Thank you.